Hello, this is Paul Randall, and this is the demo that accompanies the Resource Governor module. What I want to show you in this demo is the effect of Resource Governor on a couple of workloads and how you can use the Resource Governor to effectively do workload throttling. The scenario that I'm going to use for this demo is a server that's being used by a marketing group and a development group. And I want to make sure that when the development group wants to run some tests, for instance, that the workload that's being run by marketing doesn't interrupt the development group. So what I'm going to do is set up Resource Governor so that when the workload group spins up, any marketing group that's running is going to get throttled. And we're going to set that up and we're going to look at it actually happening in Perf1. So in my script here, what I'm going to do first of all is check whether I've got the Resource Governor set up at all. And I can use this DMV to do that. And what this DMV is going to give us is it's going to tell us two things: whether we have defined what's called a T-SQL classifier function, and in this case we haven't because the value here is 0. And this is the object ID, the relational object ID of the classifier function. And it also tells us whether there's a reconfiguration of the Resource Governor pending or not. When you make changes to the Resource Governor, as I'm going to show you, they don't actually take effect until you do an explicit reconfigure, which means that you can make a variety of changes to the Resource Governor configuration and do a reconfigure, and they all get picked up at once, rather than having piecemeal changes getting picked up and having some kind of weird intermediate states. So we don't have any Resource Governor running, so we're going to go and set all this stuff up. Now, my two groups that I said were marketing and development, and I'm going to define what's called a resource pool for each of these, and this is what I'm going to use to set the maximum amount of CPU that each of these groups can use when the Resource Governor decides that there's some contention for resources. Now, a very important point, that the Resource Governor only actually throttles workload when there is contention for resources. So as we'll see later on in the demo, when I've only got a marketing workload running, it's going to quite happily use more than 30% of the CPU. It's only when there's contention that the CPU gets throttled down to, say, 30%. So I go ahead and create these two resource pools, and then I can have a look. There's a variety of DMVs that we can use to see what kind of setup we've got. So the one that looks at resource pools is this one. I can go ahead and see whether my two resource pools show up. And they don't, because I haven't reconfigured the Resource Governor yet. But you can see that there are a couple of resource pools that are already defined, one called internal and one called default. The internal pool is the one that all of the background tasks in SQL Server use. Things like lazy writer, things like background auto shrink if you have that turned on, which you shouldn't. Things like login processing, that also happens as in the internal pool. So all these different things will use the internal pool. The internal pool has no limits on it at all, and it will pressurize everything else in the system. So it always gets all these background jobs always get the resources that they need. There's another one called the default pool. Now, as we're going to see when we look at our classification function, our classifier function, if you don't specify the name of a classification of a workload group, then your new connection gets dropped into what's called the default group. Now, the default group is a kind of catch-all. It also has no limits on the resources it can use, but everything else will pressurize it. So in other words, the default group is the kind of lowest peg on the totem pole, if you will, and the internal group is the highest. And all the ones that we're going to define come in between. So if we go ahead and do a reconfigure and then look at that DMV again, we'll see that there's our two pools that have been created. So now let's go and create our workload groups. So the workload groups are basically the buckets that the connections get dropped into, and a workload group is paired up with a resource pool, and that defines the limits to the resources that can be used. So I've got a marketing group, workload group, and I've got a development group, workload group. I'll go ahead and create both of those. If we have a look at the DMV that lists workload groups, we'll see that they're not listed yet because I haven't done a reconfigure, but there's my internal and default ones. So I go ahead and reconfigure, run the DMV again, and there's our two groups. So now I'm going to create a couple of databases to use, one for marketing and one for development. And we can carry on looking at our classifier function now. So the classifier function has to be a T-SQL classifier function. So it has to be a T-SQL function, and it has to be defined to return a sysname with schema binding. You can do anything you like within the classifier function. You cannot define a CLR function. You have to define a T-SQL one that can call a CLR function if you want inside it. Now, as I said, you can do anything you like inside the classifier function as long as you spit out the name of one of your defined workload groups. Now, I'm just been very simple in saying what was the database name that was specified on the original connection string, and that's how I'm going to differentiate between the different groups. But you could have it as complicated as you want. Be careful you don't make it too complicated though, because the classifier function gets run at login time. If your classifier function takes a very long time to run, and you've got a query timeout set, a low query timeout set, you might effectively blow your query timeout by running a complicated classifier function. Just same kind of thing as if you've got a long-running logon trigger. So I go ahead and create my classifier function now. Now you could do something interesting, like you could set it so that between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. you have a similar kind of setup to what I have, and then from say 5 p.m. round to 9 a.m. your background maintenance tasks and so on get the lion's share of the resources. So now I've got my classifier function set up. Now I tell the resource governor what my classifier function is, I reconfigure it, and then the resource governor is now running. If we go back to that initial DMV I ran right at the start of the demo and run it again, we'll see now that the classifier function's relational object ID is plugged in there. So now let's go to perfmon, and what I want to do is allow us to look and see what's happening. So let's get rid of this one. And I'm going to add in a couple of perf counters from the resource governor, resource pool stats. So I'd like to look at CPU usage for my development pool and my marketing pool. Okay, so there's nothing running at the moment. And if I start up a workload, let's start up a workload for marketing. So I have a bunch of connections. What these connections are doing is they go in, they create a table, they populate the table, and then they basically run alter, index, reorganize in a loop. So we can see that the workload here is taking, I'll highlight it in black. So this is my marketing workload, and even though I set my marketing resource pool to be limited to 30% of the CPU, there's nothing else running on this box at the moment. So there's no reason for there to be any throttling going on. The throttling only happens again when there is contention for resources. Now I started up a whole bunch of different connections because my laptop has 4 cores hyper-threaded, so I've actually got 8 schedulers in here, and I want to make sure that every one of the schedulers has some work going on it inside SQL Server. So if I then start up a development workload, go back over to perfmon, we're going to see the development workload in red here, and we're going to see it starting to ramp up on the resources that it needs, and we're seeing that the marketing group is gradually getting ramped down. Now eventually, there we go, we're going to see some dramatic changes where all the connections that are doing the development group have got to the point where they're all running this alter, index, reorganize in a loop. They're all burning a lot of CPU, and it's going to cause the resource governor to throttle down the marketing group's use of the CPU. It'll take a few seconds to get there, but we'll see it eventually. There we go. So we see that dramatic crossover there, where we've limited the marketing group to 30% of the CPU, and we've said to the development group to get around 70%, and they're kind of going up and down a little bit between there, but you can see basically that the resource governor did actually throttle the amount of resources that marketing was able to use. Now, what about if we make some changes to what's going on? And we can see that it's not quite a dead straight line, and you can see there's kind of peaks and troughs, and the peaks and troughs basically match up between the two lines. So if we go over and let's go back to Management Studio, and we've done all this. How about if we go and make some changes to the resource pools? Now what I'm going to do while we've got these workloads running, I'm going to say, well, okay, it's not quite fair that it's split 30%, 70%. Let's make sure it's 50-50. So they at least can both run, and they're not going to have too much of a detrimental effect on each other. So if I go and do this and then switch back over to here, what we'll see is that very gradually the amount of CPU being used by both of those workloads will get limited to around 50%. We'll see those lines coming closer and closer and closer together. And we saw a kind of dramatic drop from this point down to about this point, but now we can see that they're getting closer and closer together. Now this is because the changes that happen to the resource governor when you have active workloads might not be instantaneous. It might need to wait for maybe new connections to come in. It might need to wait for whatever's running to stop running. So sometimes you won't see an immediate dramatic change when you make a change. So we can see there that the changes that we made have taken an effect. Okay, what about if we stop the workload that's running for development? So if I stop the development workload, I go over here and run my stop development workload, all the development connections go away, and we can see that the development, the red line, the development CPU has gone because there's no development workload running now. And as soon as we do that, the throttling that was happening for the marketing workload isn't needed anymore. So the marketing workload just ramps back up to as much CPU as it needs. Remember that the throttling only happens when there is contention. Okay. So now I'm going to stop the marketing workload as well, but I want to show you one last thing. If I go in here and I can make a change to the workload group, what I'm going to do for the marketing group is I'm going to say I only want there to be maximum of 2 connections at once to that are using the marketing group. So I go ahead and do that. Now that's not going to affect anything that's running already. Look at all these windows down here that are connected up and using the marketing workload group. None of those get terminated, but it means that I can't have any extra connections while I've got more than 2. So if I run the command here to stop the marketing workload, which basically goes in and tries to stop every one of those connections, they just sit there. Now, remember when I did that for the development workload, everything just stopped straight away. But because I've set the maximum number of connections to 2, none of these connections can actually be made to SQL Server to go in and allow the marketing workload to stop. If I go back into the T-SQL and reset the number of requests that are allowed for the marketing workload group to 0, which is the default, which means unlimited, watch what happens as soon as I execute this. Everything gets to connect, boom, and everything goes away. Very interesting. So now, if I want to clean up a resource governor setup, first thing I have to do is disable it, and then I can drop all my workload groups, drop my resource pools, get rid of my databases, get rid of my functions, and then I have to reconfigure, and that gets rid of everything for good. So there's just a quick demo showing you how Resource Governor works. A very simple example, but it does show you how it can pick up and notice that there's contention and apply throttling based on what we've said for our resource pools. And I also showed you making dynamic changes to the Resource Governor as well. Thank you.